Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to another quiet journey into history, told at a pace meant not to excite you, but to settle you. Here, in this dim and gentle corner of the night, stories of centuries past become less like battles and more like whispers, lingering in the soft folds of time. If you are new here, I invite you to make yourself comfortable. You may wish to subscribe to this channel so that each new story arrives quietly for you when evening returns. And, if you like, you can leave a small comment, even a word or a thought. It helps the story linger a little longer and reminds me that others too wander through history in the calm of the night. Tonight, we turn to a curious corner of medieval England, a time of cloaks and cloisters, of parchment and prayers, of kings with stern tempers and barons with shifting loyalties. It was the 12th century, and England was ruled by Henry II, a king both restless and calculating, both harsh and thoughtful. And at his court, among the bishops and knights, among the clerks and poets, there was, so the records tell us, a performer of an unusual craft. His duty was not to wield a sword, nor to ink a charter. His craft was the fart, not in secret, not in shame, but openly, as a courtly act. He was remembered for a peculiar Christmas performance, a dance that ended with 3 gestures, a leap, a whistle, and a fart. For this, it is said, he was granted an estate. The man's name has come down to us as Roland Furter. In tonight's story, we will not mock him, nor will we treat the tale as a jest to make us laugh and turn quickly away. Instead, we will linger with it, as one lingers with a curious leaf pressed between the pages of a book. Slowly, gently, we will unfold what such a role meant, what kind of world surrounded it, and what kind of life a man like Roland may have known. Our purpose is not to hurry to a punchline, but to drift through the atmosphere of that age. To imagine halls where fires crackled, where minstrels plucked strings, where jesters capered, and where, once a year, a professional of bodily jest was called to perform his craft as part of the Yuletide celebrations. So let us begin, and let us do so slowly, as if each word were a candle placed along a long corridor, illuminating step by step the passage of time. To understand Roland's curious place in history, we must first imagine Henry II's court, not as a place of constant battle, though wars often raged at the edges of his realm, but as a household, a great shifting household of retainers, clerks, cooks, guards, musicians, priests, scribes, and fools. The king traveled often, as was the custom of the age. Unlike monarchs of later centuries who kept their courts fixed in London, a 12th century ruler was itinerant. He moved from castle to castle, from manor to manor, consuming the provisions of one household before moving on to the next. His court was not a palace fixed in stone, but a company on the move. And wherever the king went, so too went his entertainment. In an age before printing presses, before theaters as we know them, before public concerts, the court itself was the stage. Musicians, singers, and performers were expected to follow, to amuse, to divert. For a restless king like Henry, who ruled not only England but also wide territories in France, the court was a moving world in miniature, carrying with it the color and sound of culture. Among this company were the jesters and fools. Some told jokes, others played tricks, some juggled or mimed, and a few specialized in feats of the body. Their task was not simply to amuse, but to provide contrast. Amid the weighty discussions of law and the heavy negotiations of feudal politics, laughter was a relief, a release of tension, a softening of the hard edges of rule. It is in this context that we must picture Roland. Roland is not a figure of legend alone. His name appears in legal documents, dry as parchment, noting his grant of land. The record tells us that his unusual service, the leap, the whistle, and the fart, was rewarded with an estate in Suffolk. In the 12th century, land was the measure of wealth and security. To hold an estate meant not only income, but status. What does this mean? That Henry II valued this performance enough to tie it to a feudal obligation. Roland's yearly act was not a casual prank, but a duty, a service owed, just as another man might owe a knight's service or the provision of horses. Roland owed a performance. Imagine that for a moment. In a world of charters and obligations, where men pledged to bring spears or wheat or prayers, Roland's obligation was to bring his body to the Christmas hall, to dance, to leap, to whistle, and to end with a well-timed expulsion of air. In the records, the act is described not crudely, but matter-of-factly, as if it were no stranger than the obligation of another man to present a hawk or a brace of hounds. It is this contrast, the seriousness of the record and the frivolity of the act, that makes the story linger. Christmas in the 12th century was not the quiet domestic holiday we might picture today. It was a season of feasting, of gathering, of games and performance. For the court of Henry II, it was a moment to display wealth and magnificence, to feed not only the household but visiting lords and ambassadors. Halls were warmed with fires. Tables were set with roasted meats, with spiced dishes, with ale and wine. Musicians played, clerks recited verses, minstrels sang of Arthur and Troy. Amid the solemnities of Mass and the rituals of the church, there was also room for laughter and jest. And it was here, in this balance between sacred and profane, that Roland's act took place. Picture it not as an interruption, but as part of a cycle. A court that had heard readings of Scripture in the morning might by evening wish for lighter fare. The performance of a jester was not an insult to holiness, but a compliment to it, reminding those present that joy, too, had its place in the season. The leap, the whistle, the fart. It sounds abrupt when put so plainly, but in the rhythm of courtly entertainment, it would have been a familiar pattern. A dance, an acrobatic gesture, a playful sound, a release of laughter. Roland's role was small, but it was woven into the larger fabric of court life. As we sit with this story, it may be tempting to smile, or even to laugh, and that is not wrong. But here, in the quiet of the night, let us hold the story more softly. It reminds us that the past was not only wars and kings and parchments, but also the human need for humor. That even in a hall filled with knights in chainmail and clerks bent over charters, there was room for a man whose gift was bodily jest. And that this gift was not dismissed, but rewarded. An estate for a performance. A place in the record books not for slaying, but for making men laugh. In this, Roland the Farter becomes a symbol of something more enduring. The way laughter, even in the sternest of times, can find a place, can earn its keep, can leave a trace in the archives of history. As we leave the threshold, then step further into history, we allow the light to spread slowly across the wider hall of Henry II's England. This evening, we will not rush to the most special act, the leap, the whistle, the puck, but instead, we'll rest long in the world that made such an act possible. For if we are to understand Roland, we must first understand the court he served, not simply as a backdrop, but as a living, breathing family, moving across the landscape of medieval England and Normandy, like a great caravan of power. Let us go quietly into that world. Henry II was not a man who sat still. His reign, which stretched from 1154 to 1189, was a constant motion. He ruled not only England, but also great territories in France, Anjou, Normandy, Aquitaine through his marriage to Eleanor. His dominion was vast, stretching from the cold northern shores of England to the sunlit vineyards of southern France. But he was no distant monarch sitting on a throne in London. He traveled incessantly, inspecting castles, hearing cases, negotiating disputes. Chroniclers noted how restless he was, often sleeping little, always eager to move on. And when the king moved, his household moved with him. This household was not a small entourage, but a large company of clerks, knights, servants, cooks, entertainers, falconers, chaplains, and scribes. It was, in effect, a court on wheels. Imagine the sight. Wagons loaded with provisions, pack animals carrying bedding and robes, clerks guarding chests of parchment and seals, cooks bringing their knives and pots, jesters carrying their bells, and minstrels with their harps. The court was a living tide, spilling into one castle, consuming its stores, then departing again to the next. In this constant movement, everyone had their place. The knights provided protection, the clerks ensured the king's commands were written and sealed, the servants tended to the needs of the body, and the entertainers tended to the needs of the spirit. Among this household were those whose role was not to govern nor to fight, but to bring laughter and music. Their value was real, though it was not measured in swords or in statutes. It was measured in the ability to shift the atmosphere of the hall, to lift weariness, to punctuate solemnity with levity. The medieval jester was not quite the fool we picture in bright motley and cap with bells, though such figures existed too. He was often a man of many talents, able to sing, recite verses, juggle, perform tricks, and yes, sometimes, to use the body itself as instrument and joke. To understand why Henry II would grant land for such an act, we must recall how important these entertainments were in a world without printed books, without theater in every city, without organized spectacles beyond church festivals. The hall itself was the stage. A man who could provoke laughter at will was, in a sense, a keeper of morale. Christmas especially was a time when these performers were called forward. The feasts of the 12 days were long and elaborate. There was ritual, there was mass, there was feasting, but there was also time for games, riddles, and jest. Roland's performance was part of this larger fabric, a weaving together of sacred observance and festive play. Let us picture the hall at Christmas. Slowly, detail by detail, as though walking from the doorway inward. At the far end, raised slightly, would be the king's table. Upon it, platters of roasted meats, trenchers of bread, cups of silver or pewter filled with spiced wine. The king himself would be dressed not in armor, but in robes suited to the season. Furs against the cold, perhaps a cloak lined with ermine, a simple circlet or crown to mark his place. Beside him, his queen or his family. Around him, the high nobles and the most trusted clerks. The hall would stretch wide, filled with other tables set lower. At these, knights, clerks, servants, and retainers would eat according to rank. Food would move from kitchen to table in steady procession. Roasted boar, venison, geese, stews thick with barley, loaves of bread, wheels of cheese, trenchers to soak up the juices. The smell would be heavy with smoke and spice, the warmth of the fires pressing back the winter's chill. Music would fill the air. minstrels with harps or fiddles, voices singing carols in Latin or French, verses of saints or of heroes. And between these solemn pieces, lighter songs, tales of tricksters, refrains easy to sing along with after a cup of wine. Into this setting, entertainers like Roland were called, not to interrupt but to punctuate, like a spark of mischief in the midst of grandeur. The Christmas feast was not one night, but 12 days. Each had its own rhythm, blending devotion with diversion. On Christmas Day itself, the emphasis was on the sacred, Mass in the morning, feasting afterward. But as the days continued, the spirit of festivity grew freer. Games were played, dice, chess, riddles. Masks and mummers appeared. Stories of saints might be followed by stories of Arthur and his knights. It was during these days that performers like Roland earned their place. A well-timed jest, a song, or a trick could shift the mood from solemn to merry, from weary to joyful. The leap, the whistle, the fart. It was not crude, but fitting in its moment, a reminder that laughter, too, was part of the season's abundance. And yet, Roland's act was not simply voluntary. It was tied to land, to duty. His estate in Suffolk was granted not as a gift, but as a tenure. He held it on condition of service. Just as a knight held land in exchange for military aid, Roland held land in exchange for his yearly performance. This was the feudal system at work. Everything owed, everything accounted, even laughter. This meant that Roland was not an outsider or a hanger-on. He was a tenant-in-chief, a man with legal obligations, bound to the king. His performance was not a mere jest, but a recognized service in the tapestry of feudal obligation. We might smile at this, but it reveals something profound about the age. That the body itself, in its most basic functions, could be woven into the machinery of law and duty. As we rest in this picture of the court, it may strike us as both strange and familiar. Strange, because the idea of a man owed to fart once a year for the king feels almost absurd to modern ears. Familiar, because we too live in a world where entertainers are paid for their gifts, where laughter is valued, where celebrations blend solemnity with levity. The medieval court was not so distant after all. It was a place where music, food, faith, and jest all mingled, where a restless king needed laughter as much as he needed counsel, where a man could find his livelihood, not through the sword, but through the ability to provoke a smile. We see the king restless on his throne, his household in constant motion, his Christmas feasts long and abundant, and his entertainers valued for their role in keeping the hall alive with sound and laughter. Roland, with his peculiar duty, is no longer a figure of mockery, but a man set within a system. His service as real as that of the knight or the clerk. The word jester summons to modern minds an image of bright motley, a cap with bells, and a painted grin. Yet the medieval fool was not always so garish. He came in many forms, and his role was broader than the mere caricature we imagine. Some fools were wise, their folly a mask for sharp commentary. Others were simple, their innocence making their jests seem harmless, even when they touched sensitive truths. Some were acrobats, skilled in tumbling and tricks. Some were minstrels who turned their music to comic effect. And some, like Roland, specialized in feats of the body, performances so simple, so immediate, that no explanation was needed. The medieval world valued this variety. At a time when philosophy was written in Latin, when laws were composed in stern charters, when sermons poured forth in dense language, the fool's task was to cut through with simplicity. A pratfall, a pun, or even a bodily noise was understood by all, from the lowest servant to the king himself. The court of Henry II was a place of hierarchy, every man and woman aware of rank. At table, seating was arranged by status. In law, obligations were carefully measured. In speech, one's words were chosen carefully, lest offense rise. The jester alone had license to cross these lines. He could mock where others dared not. He could perform acts that would be shameful if done in earnest, but which in jest became tolerated, even celebrated. In this, the fool provided a valuable service, a safety valve for the strict order of court life. Roland's act, simple as it seems, fit neatly into this function. In a hall where bishops sat beside barons, and where knights waited for a nod from the king, the sudden absurdity of a dance, ending with a whistle and a fart, broke the tension. It reminded all present of the shared humanity beneath the layers of rank. In the Middle Ages, the body was often treated with suspicion by the church. Flesh was weak, desires dangerous, indulgence sinful. Yet the body was also inescapable. It labored, it ached, it hungered, and it laughed. Entertainers who used the body itself, jugglers, dancers, mimics, and yes, farders, took what was ordinary and transformed it into spectacle. A somersault was a simple flip of the body, but in the hall, it became a marvel. A fart was a natural sound, but in the hall, it became an artful conclusion to a performance. We may smile at this, but in truth, it speaks to a deeper truth. The medieval court did not deny the body. It placed it within ritual. Roland's yearly duty was not a random prank, but a ritualized act. The leap, the whistle, the fart. 3 gestures, repeated, expected, awaited. Like the gestures of a priest at the altar, or the bow of a knight before his lord. Roland's gestures carried meaning by repetition. The body, in its simplest functions, was woven into the rhythm of the feast. Roland was not alone in his craft. In other lands, too, performers of bodily humor were known. In France, stories tell of jesters who burped on command or mimicked the sounds of animals. In Ireland, poets and fools sometimes mocked kings with earthy rhymes. In Scandinavia, sagas recall men who capered and made strange sounds for laughter in great halls. Even in classical Rome, centuries before Henry II, there were performers called fartari, who amused audiences with controlled bodily noises. The thread stretches long across time. The simple act of turning what is natural into performance has always had its place in human society. Roland, then, was part of a much larger tradition, the tradition of turning folly into art, and art into obligation. One might wonder, was the fool not in danger, mocking or jesting before powerful men? Could a badly timed performance not provoke anger? It could. Yet fools were often granted protection. Their status as licensed jesters gave them a freedom denied to others. Roland's estate was not only payment, it was a form of protection. His service was recognized, his duty recorded. He was not a wandering trickster at risk of a beating, but a man bound by law to perform, and therefore protected by law as well. This status gave jesters a curious place in the medieval order. They stood both inside and outside the hierarchy, mocked themselves, but untouchable in their folly. When we think of Roland, we might want to imagine the hall laughing out loud at his act. And perhaps it did. But in the quiet of reflection, we can see it more softly. A ritual, an anticipated moment, a performance that signaled not just entertainment, but continuity. Year after year at Christmas, Roland would step forward. He would leap, he would whistle, he would fart. And the court would laugh, not just at the sound, but at its familiarity, at the comfort of tradition. In a world of wars, betrayals, shifting loyalties, and restless kings, there was one constant, a small, absurd anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The candlelight shows us the wider place of the jester, the role of humor in a hierarchical court, the body as instrument, the jester as a protected figure. Roland now stands among others of his kind, not an isolated curiosity, but part of a long tradition of folly woven into the fabric of human celebration. To modern minds, Christmas often feels like a single day, or at most, a short week of celebration. But in the 12th century, it stretched longer, filling the calendar with ritual and festivity. The 12 days of Christmas, beginning on December 25th and ending on January 6th with the Feast of the Epiphany, were understood as a sacred cycle. Each day held meaning. Some were marked by solemn liturgy, others by feasting, gift-giving, or playful customs. The length of this season gave ample room for variety. Devotion and merriment existed side by side, like alternating verses of a long hymn. And it was within this rhythm that entertainment found its natural place. At its heart, Christmas was a religious feast. Midnight Mass on Christmas Eve, the solemn reading of the Nativity story, the chanting of hymns in Latin. These were the anchors of the season. The cold stone of chapels and great churches was warmed by candlelight. Clergy in robes intoned the familiar words. The air was thick with incense. For those gathered, it was a reminder of salvation, a turning of hearts toward mystery. Even the king himself was expected to bow before the altar, to hear Mass with due reverence. Henry II, restless and pragmatic as he was, would have joined in these sacred observances, if only as a sign of kingship properly aligned with faith. Thus, every jest and feast that followed was framed by holiness. The laughter of the hall did not replace devotion, but was set beside it, a complement rather than a contradiction. After worship came feasting, and feasting, too, was a kind of ritual. It proclaimed abundance in the depth of winter, hospitality in the coldest season. Tables were heavy with meats, boar's head dressed with herbs, venison from the hunt, roasted fowl. Dishes were flavored with imported spices, cinnamon, cloves, pepper. Luxuries that signaled wealth and connection to distant trade routes. Ale and wine flowed freely. Trenchers of bread were laid out to serve as both plate and sustenance. Stews thick with grains warmed bellies. Sweetmeats and candied fruits ended meals with a taste of brightness amid the dark. The act of feasting was not indulgence alone, but symbol. The king, by feeding his household, displayed his generosity. The abundance of the table was a reflection of the abundance of rule. Into this setting poured sound. Minstrels with harps and fiddles filled the air with melody. Singers lifted voices in carols, some sacred, some playful. Clerks recited verses in French or Latin, their words carrying echoes of saints or heroes. And among these voices came the lighter tones of jesters. Their jokes, their tricks, their capers punctuated the music like bright sparks in a steady fire. Roland's whistle would have joined this soundscape. Not as a disruption, but as a note within the larger chord of the season. His leap and his final gesture, too, would have been part of this symphony of noise, each sound carefully placed in the expectation of the hall. Beyond food and music, Christmastide was filled with games. Dice and chess were played at tables. Riddles were asked and answered. Mummers in masks sometimes appeared, acting out small plays or mocking scenes. The line between solemnity and mischief was thin. On certain days, Boys might be elected mock bishops, turning order upside down for a brief time. Priests, in some places, joined in playful rituals that mixed parody with devotion. These customs reflected an old truth, that in the darkest season, human beings crave both reverence and laughter. The one does not cancel the other, but makes it fuller. For Henry II's court, Christmas was a time to display magnificence. Nobles from across his realms gathered. Ambassadors from abroad might be present. To host them well was a matter of politics as much as piety. Thus, the court became a stage. Every dish served, every song sung, every performance given was part of the display. And it was here that Roland's act fit most snugly. A peculiar performance, yes, but also one that showed the court's ability to embrace folly, to laugh, to turn even the simplest human act into ritual and reward. His fart was not vulgarity in this context, but a symbol of abundance. The body unashamed, the hall untroubled, the king unthreatened. Perhaps the most striking thing about Roland's service is how it crossed rank. Bishops, barons, knights, clerks, all would have laughed together. For a brief moment, the divisions of the hall softened. The laughter was not at Roland's expense, but in shared recognition. The most basic of bodily functions, usually hidden, became the center of attention, transformed into art. In this, the court was reminded of its common humanity. A king who ruled vast lands was also a man who laughed. A bishop who preached of sin was also a man who smiled. And Roland, by offering his performance, bound them all together in this simple acknowledgement. As we sit with this image, it is important to move slowly, to let it settle. Christmas in the 12th century was not only sacred worship or royal grandeur, but also warmth, laughter, and shared humanity. Roland's place in it was small, yet enduring. His act, repeated year after year, was a thread woven into the fabric of a great feast. A reminder that even in the presence of kings, jest had its honored place. In the 12th century, entertainment at the royal court was not an afterthought. It was woven into the fabric of the gathering. To gather nobles from across the kingdom, to treat them to food and drink, was also to treat them to a spectacle. Music relieved tension, stories preserved memories, and humor softened the harsh edges of politics. The medieval court could be a difficult place, full of arguments, whispered negotiations, and strict ceremonies. Jesters and performers provided a counterbalance, making the air breathable with their skill. The jester of this time was not always the flamboyantly dressed jester of later imagination. Instead, he might wear simple clothes, sometimes colorful, sometimes plain, depending on his status. His art lay not in costume, but in words, timing, and courage. A medieval jester might recite comic verses, juggle, or mime. He might mock the manners of knights or even gently joke about the king himself. Always with caution, for laughter could quickly turn into insult if it crossed the line. It was in this circle of jesters that Roland's unusual performance belonged. His act, though remembered now for its strangeness, shared the spirit of the profession. A mixture of play, laughter, and a touch of absurdity, designed to please. Alongside the jesters stood the minstrels. With harp, lute, or violin, they wove threads of melody through the heavy air of the hall. Some recited chansons de geste, long epic poems about battles and heroes. Others sang ballads of courtly love, drawing noble listeners into imaginary romances. These musicians did more than entertain. They reminded the gathering of the ideals of their world: courage, loyalty, devotion, love. Their songs were mirrors in which the court saw itself in a more refined form. However, like the jesters, the minstrels also knew lighter melodies, playful melodies that suited the laughter of the audience and relaxed the stiffness of the noble posture. We must not forget the acrobats and acrobats. In stone halls or open courtyards, they bent their bodies into shapes that were at once strange and wondrous. They did somersaults, balanced on their hands, or performed leaps that caused awe. In a world where life was often hard and survival difficult, these displays of agility reminded us of human possibilities. The body as an instrument of wonder. Into this world of diverse performers entered Roland, a man of dance, whistle, and final gesture that echoes through the centuries. He was not entirely different from the others. His performance, though unique, was born of the same spirit: to create relaxation, to evoke laughter, to balance the solemnity of the holiday with faith. While the minstrels strummed and the jesters joked, Roland's performance unfolded as something unexpected, perhaps even shocking, but certainly part of the carnival spirit of Christmas time. We see that Roland was not alone. He stood among those who, in their own way, lightened the burden of court life. Without them, the long Christmas season would have been incomplete, and the burden of power would not have been tempered by joy. Now, in the glow of this candle, we dwell on one figure, Roland, a man whose interesting role has brought his name to the sidelines of history. It is through dry parchment that we glimpse him. Legal documents, charters, and grants speak his name with the same gravity as knights and barons. Roland Furter, as he came to be remembered, was not simply a fleeting jester, but a man entrusted with land, bound by the same seals and oaths that governed others. His estate, granted for services at Christmas, gives shape to the seriousness with which his peculiar art was regarded. What seems to us whimsical, even absurd, bore the dignity of legal acknowledgement. The record tells us his duty. Once each year, at the court's Christmas feast, he was to perform. His routine was precise, set like the steps of a liturgy. A dance, marking rhythm with movement, likely drawing laughter in its rising energy. A whistle, sharp and light, piercing the murmurs of the hall. And finally, the act that sealed his name. A fart, deliberate, punctuating the performance like a period at the end of a sentence. This triad, jump, whistle, and fart, was both the comedy and the conclusion. It was at once physical humor and a ritualized gesture, known, expected, and awaited by those gathered. To us, such an act may seem unworthy of note, but in medieval culture, humor of the body held a natural place. Laughter often dwelled in what was earthy, physical, and close to life's cycles. The rustic jest, the comic song, and the exaggerated bodily act all drew smiles in a world where hardship was never far. Laughter, then, was not only amusement but release, a reminder of the shared humanity that linked noble and peasant alike. Roland's role was not accidental. It stood at the intersection of necessity and tradition. He embodied, in that single act, the carnival spirit of Christmas, when solemnity and silliness joined hands. The reward for this duty was not a coin or a tunic, but land itself, the manor of Hemingstone in Norfolk. To hold land was to hold power, livelihood, and standing. That such a grant could be tied to so strange a performance reminds us of the blending of jest and seriousness that marked Henry's reign. The manor tethered Roland to the soil of England as much as his act tethered him to memory. His body, his performance, and the land became linked in a chain that history has preserved. Roland, the unusual performer, was no passing curiosity. He was woven into the court's life, his act as expected as Mass at Christmas or venison at the feast. He lived in that paradox of the medieval world, where the profound and the playful did not exclude one another, but coexisted, bound together in ceremony. At the center of the hall sat the king, Henry II, surrounded by his family and closest advisors. Alongside him were nobles of high rank, men who held castles and commanded knights. They were accustomed to ceremonies, to the stern order of law and warfare. Yet even they, seated high, were not immune to laughter. One can imagine them leaning forward as Roland began his steps, smiling faintly at first, their expressions guarded. With the whistle, a sound so small in contrast to the grandeur of the hall, the guard might break. Shoulders would ease, lips curl, and at the final, expected conclusion, laughter would ripple, contained but genuine, even at the highest table. Not far from the nobles sat men of the church, bishops, abbots, and learned clerks, their robes heavy with symbolism, their minds attuned to theology. For them, humor of the body was a delicate matter. Yet even among the clergy, Christmas was a season of loosened restraint. They too partook of feasts, wine, and song. The jest, when framed within ritual, could be tolerated, even enjoyed. Perhaps a bishop smiled discreetly into his cup, or a monk allowed himself a brief chuckle, quickly hidden beneath the folds of his cowl. The laughter of the clergy, though restrained, signaled the temporary inversion of the world permitted by the Christmas season. Lower along the table sat knights, squires, and men of lesser titles. For them, Roland's act may have struck closer to rustic humor, the kind more freely enjoyed in manor halls and village greens. Their laughter would have been fuller, less contained. They might nudge one another, exchange knowing glances, or even cheer at the conclusion. For them, the performance was not merely tolerated ritual, but a genuine delight, a release from the weight of duty. At the edges of the hall, moving quietly with trenchers and pitchers, stood the servants. Their role was humble, but their ears and eyes were always open. For them, Roland's performance was a rare moment where noble and common found themselves united in a single, shared sound: laughter. Though they could not join openly, one imagines smiles breaking across their faces as they passed between tables, the heavy jugs of ale balanced carefully in hand. And at the center of it all was Henry himself, the king known for his short cloak and restless energy. History does not tell us how he reacted in the moment. Yet the gift of land to Roland speaks more loudly than words. To reward a man so richly for so strange an act suggests not mere tolerance, but appreciation, even affection. It is possible that Henry laughed heartily, enjoying the absurdity as a relief from the burdens of kingship. Or perhaps his pleasure lay in the act's regularity, its ritual nature, the comfort of a familiar jest repeated year after year. Whatever the nuances of individual reactions, what mattered most was the shared experience. For a moment, the divisions of rank, wealth, and role blurred. From king to knight, from bishop to servant, all were bound together in the sound of mirth. This laughter was not disruptive, but unifying. It was the gentle loosening of a bowstring, releasing tension accumulated over the year. Roland's act was less a vulgarity than a communal ritual, sealing the feast with humor as much as the priest sealed Mass with prayer. We see Roland no longer as an isolated performer, but as a figure in a circle, a man who, by his special craft, transformed a hall of diverse lives into a moment of collective liberation. In the flicker of torchlight in the echo of stone, his performance was at once small and immense, a fragment of human folly woven into the fabric of royal ceremony. The laughter has long since died away, but in the memory of parchment and the imagination of the night it still rings, faint, distant, and lingering. Christmas in the Middle Ages stretched well beyond a single day. From Advent to Epiphany, the court entered a rhythm of celebration. Feasts replaced fasts, fires glowed through long nights, and halls were filled with merriment. It was a season when daily burdens were set aside, and laughter, song, and ritual lightened the atmosphere. In this context, acts that might seem unseemly in another season could be permitted, even welcomed. What mattered was the spirit of release, the suspension of ordinary rules, and the reminder that joy was part of the human order. Inversion was the soul of carnival. For a brief time, hierarchies softened. The solemn became silly, the powerful were gently mocked, and the ordinary might be celebrated. In village festivals, peasants parodied priests. In towns, students played the fool at the expense of masters. At the royal court, this spirit of inversion appeared more carefully, more formally. Yet it was still present. Roland's act embodied this. His performance brought bodily humor, something associated with rustic laughter, into the very center of royal ceremony. The king himself became an audience to a joke that, in ordinary life, might have belonged only to the fields and taverns. When viewed in this light, Roland's act seems less arbitrary. The whistle was not only sound, but signal, a break in solemnity, a reminder of levity. The final fart, though comic, was also a marker, the definitive conclusion of inversion. It was as if the body itself spoke in place of words, sealing the moment with an earthy punctuation. The laughter that followed was not scandal, but recognition. Those present understood that the rules of order had been reversed, and that this reversal was not dangerous, but essential. The medieval world did not see a contradiction in allowing sacred ceremony and comic inversion to stand side by side. Rather, it understood that the two belonged together. Too much solemnity could harden into severity. Too much jest without structure could slip into chaos. The feast balanced both, a mass by day, a jest by evening, each strengthening the other. Roland's role, then, was not an accident of history. He was part of the machinery that maintained this balance, ensuring that even in the gravity of kingship, laughter had its proper place. When we look back across centuries, it is tempting to treat Roland's performance as trivial, a footnote in the vast ledger of history. But within his small act lies a mirror to the culture that valued him. His fart was not only noise, but symbol, a reminder that life in its fullness contains both prayer and play, dignity and absurdity. His dance was less about laughter alone than about reminding a court, heavy with responsibility, that the world is never only solemn. It is also, always, a place of gentle foolishness. We are taken from the crowded warmth of the royal hall into the gentler silence of the English countryside. Here, far from the royal table and the echoes of laughter on stone, we find Roland's reward, the estate of Hemingston in Norfolk, the place where his curious service was transformed into land, fields, and a livelihood. Norfolk in the 12th century was a land of wide skies and low fields, threaded with rivers and marshes. Villages clustered around churches, their flint towers rising above thatched roofs. Sheep grazed in pastures, and narrow lanes wound between hedges. It was into this setting that Roland stepped, not only as performer, but as landholder. His estate tied him not just to the memory of a single jest, but to the rhythms of plough, harvest, and tithe. The gift of Hemingstone was more than symbolic. A manor meant rents from tenants, rights to woodlands or meadows, and obligations to both crown and church. For Roland, the performer, it meant that his yearly act in the royal hall was balanced by a steady life upon the land. This grant speaks to the seriousness with which his role was regarded. It was not an idle favor, but a binding exchange. Service for stability, performance for permanence. We may picture Roland walking the boundary of his fields, noting the furrows cut by the plowmen, speaking with tenants, or listening to the lowing of cattle. His estate was modest compared to great baronies, yet it rooted him. The manor house would have been simple. A timber hall, perhaps, with a hearth in the center and smoke rising through the roof. Within, his family or household lived by the same rhythms as countless others. Bread baked, ale brewed, and wool spun. It is striking to imagine that a man remembered for a jest might also have sat in quiet at dusk, listening to the wind over the flat fields, or walked the narrow churchyard path on Sunday, head bowed in prayer. Roland's life was divided between two spheres. At Christmas, he journeyed to court, entered the grandeur of kingship, and played his peculiar role in the ritual of laughter. For the rest of the year, he lived among villagers and tenants, a small lord of a small manor, his duties not of jest, but of stewardship. This balance between performance and landholding reflected the medieval world's interwoven nature, where roles were not sharply separated, but layered. A man might be both entertainer and landholder, servant of the king and master of peasants. Hemingstone's gift binds Roland's memory to the English soil as firmly as his deed bound him to the Christmas feast of the court. In his life, we see the paradox of the Middle Ages. Laughter could give the land, and a puck could echo across parchment like a knight's oath. We leave the hall and remain for a while in the Norfolk fields, where Roland's footsteps once pressed into the damp soil. His estate was not grand, but it was his. The reward that transformed the fleeting moment of jest into the unchanging burden of the earth. As we move away from the life Roland lived to the life his story has taken on over the centuries. For what matters in history is not just what happened, but what was remembered, and how memory preserved or changed it. Roland's name is not preserved in epic poems or grand battle chronicles. Instead, it appears in charters, legal texts, and meticulous scribal notes. These documents were intended not to entertain, but to bind obligations, confirm rights, and leave evidence for future generations. Yet, in this humble place, his memory lived on. The duty to dance, whistle, and fart was written in the same ink that recorded the duties of knights and the privileges of abbots. It was the law that preserved his joke, and the law that gave it weight. Without these records, Roland would have disappeared, his laughter lost in the smoke of forgotten halls. Across centuries, scholars, antiquarians, and even poets stumbled upon his name in the archives. Each age found its own tone in telling his story. Some recounted it as odd curiosity. Others treated it as comic relief in histories otherwise heavy with kings and wars. By the 17th century, when collectors of lore dug into medieval manuscripts, Roland had already become Roland Furter, a figure pointed to with amused disbelief. His act, once bound by legal duty, had shifted into the realm of anecdote, something to be retold at gatherings or noted in footnotes of histories. It is curious to think that parchment, so often filled with the sternest of matters, carried forward a memory of silliness. What might have been no more than a few minutes of laughter each year became, by virtue of law, something fixed, something preserved. Roland's legacy shows that memory is not governed by grandeur alone. Sometimes, what endures is the small and the strange, preserved by the same machinery that kept crowns upon heads and churches upon land. Why does his story linger with us still? Perhaps because it reminds us that history is not only kings and wars, but also jesters and laughter. That the body, in all its awkwardness, has a place in the solemn record of human life. Roland's survival in memory is not an accident, but a lesson. It shows us that what seemed small to his contemporaries, a dance and a fart, can, in time, carry as much fascination as treaties and battles. For now, we sit with an unbreakable memory. Roland lived, laughed, and died 8 centuries ago. Yet through the ink on parchment, his deed rings faintly, reminding us that history preserves not only crowns and swords, but also the quiet sound of laughter, written into law. Where in medieval thought, Roland remains both a man and a memory. The candle flickers, coming to life, and its glow draws our attention away from the parchment of the law and the Norfolk soil to the quieter realm of thought. For to fully understand Roland, we must look not only at his act and its setting, but also at how laughter itself was understood in the medieval world, how thinkers, clergy, and commoners wove humor into the fabric of a life. The 12th century church had a deeply ambivalent attitude toward laughter. On the one hand, joy was recognized as part of divine creation. The Psalms spoke of laughter and merriment. Feasts and feast days permitted moments of merriment. On the other hand, excessive laughter was considered dangerous, a distraction from prayer, a temptation to the flesh. Monastic rules often warned against excessive merriment. Silence was valued, discipline was encouraged, and monks were taught to smile sparingly. Even in monasteries, however, humor sometimes slipped through. Stories of trick saints or playful drawings in the margins of manuscripts that mocked solemn texts. So the laughter that Roland provoked was tolerated not as rebellion, but as ritual. It was allowed to have its place precisely because it was limited, seasonal, and controlled. Long before Henry II, classical philosophers had written about laughter. Aristotle described comedy as the imitation of the ridiculous, a mirror of the lesser aspects of human nature. Later writers, such as Cicero, saw wit as the art of speech, a skill that could both charm and mock. By the Middle Ages, these ideas had become intertwined with Christian doctrine. Laughter could be seen as foolishness, but also as medicine. It relieved tension, reminded people of humility, and refreshed minds weighed down by gravity. Roland's performance was the embodiment of this duality. It was low and fleshy, yet structured and masterful. In its very absurdity lay its power to refresh the hall. Outside the court and monastery, in the fields and villages, laughter had an even stronger place. Peasants wore masks at festivals, played games of upturned hands, and enjoyed obscene songs. Markets resounded with jokes and teasing. Weddings mixed solemn vows with playful tricks. For the common people, laughter was not dangerous, but necessary. A shield from hardship, a bond of community, a momentary relief from burdens. When Roland performed at court, he brought this rustic laughter into the royal space, connecting the world of the peasants with the world of kings. At this moment, the two realms touched. Medieval thought often contrasted the lofty soul with the humble body. But it was in the body that laughter found its strongest expression. Burps, farts, and exaggerated gestures became part of the comic tradition, for they reminded everyone of the common ground of life. Clergymen might frown, nobles might blush, but the laughter that followed such actions spoke of a shared humanity. Roland, with his leap, his whistle, and his fart, stood as a reminder that beneath the robes and crowns, all was flesh. We see Roland's act not as trivial, but as deeply human. It was based on a philosophy that saw laughter as folly and medicine, danger and pleasure. It connected the world of scientists and the world of the country people, the solemn and the absurd, the body and the spirit. The philosophy of laughter tells us that Roland's place was not accidental. His memory lives on because his act spoke of something timeless, the need for frivolity in a life burdened with obligations. The candle flame is softer, more gentle, as if it knows that the story has reached its end. It flickers over all that has been told, the restless king, the long feasts, the jesters and minstrels, the laughter of the nobles and peasants, the Norfolk estate, the philosophy of fun, and finally settles on Roland, the man whose special duty has led us on this quiet journey. Picking up the threads, we began with one image, a man at Christmas, bound by law to dance, whistle, and fart before the king. From this image, we wandered slowly outward, tracing the world that gave it meaning. We walked through the court of Henry II, saw its constant movement, its feasts, its hierarchies. We listened to the songs of the minstrels and the jokes of the jesters. We felt the warmth of the Christmas fire, the solemnity of the Mass, the release of laughter. We followed Roland to the fields of Norfolk, where land and livelihood were the basis of his jokes. And we delved into the philosophy of laughter itself, seeing how his act was at once low and high, tolerated and revered. Now, tying all the threads together, we see that Roland was more than just a footnote. He was a man who embodied the medieval balance of solemnity and folly, law and play, land and laughter. History often remembers battles, treaties, and crowns. But sometimes there is less left. A line in a charter, a strange commitment, a moment of absurdity preserved in ink. Roland's story reminds us that the past was not only harsh, but also light. Not only harsh, but playful. A single, carefully crafted tuft at the end of a dance could earn land, could resonate through the centuries, could remind us of humanity under power. As Christmas Eve once marked the end of a feast, so this chapter marks the end of our story. In Henry II's hall, the fire would have gone out. The minstrels would have fallen silent. The guests would have fallen asleep. The laughter evoked by Roland's performance would have faded from memory, leaving only the warmth of shared joy. And so our own journey quietly draws to a close. Roland is gone, his estate long since dissolved in the English countryside, his performance long since vanished into thin air. Yet in the stillness of the night, his memory remains. He stands not as a mockery, but as a reminder that laughter has always had a place, even in the most solemn halls. In his leap, his whistle, and his final act, we find not vulgarity, but humanity. A humanity shared by kings and peasants, monks and servants. A humanity that still reaches us through the centuries, as soft as the glow of a candle. We say goodbye to Roland, to Henry, to the hall, to the laughter, to the Norfolk fields, and to the long corridor we walked together. The story ends now, quiet, ready to merge with sleep. Good night, dear listener. May your rest be gentle, and your dreams filled with the warmth of laughter that echoes through time.